A few years ago, my brother-in-law bought another apartment complex in Florida. He owns a few of them in West Palm Beach and Miami, so when he told me he bought another one and wanted me to manage it, I figured, why the hell not? I just graduated college with my degree and planned to go out and get my master's as well. I figured I could manage his place and do graduate school. When he booked my flight to Orlando, I was stoked as hell. Yes, I love Disney, and I dreamed about buying a year pass and checking out all the neat parks. When I got there, we drove out to Orlando, and I had a bad feeling. He bought the apartment in a town called Leesburg. It's only about an hour from Orlando. It's as if a biker town and a retirement community had a baby together. I was a little disappointed that I was an hour away from Orlando, with its nightlife and clubs and whatnot. I made it work though. I soon started to settle into life there, managing the small apartment complex. I had my own one-bedroom apartment in the corner. Then there were 10 other tenants. Most were older folks, snowbirds and retirees that spent their days golfing and swimming in the pool. There were 2 military families there, one with small kids, and then there was Andy. Andy was an enormous man. I'm a pretty big guy myself, 6 foot and around 250 pounds. He was at least 6'4" and 400 plus pounds. He was absolutely gigantic. He walked with a cane and had long black hair, which he'd pulled into a ponytail. He worked from home, or so he said. There was a rumor, though, that he was on disability after a horrific work accident. That wasn't exactly something I felt it was my place to pry into. As long as he paid his rent on time and was peaceful and kept to himself, I was just fine with whatever he wanted to do. I was only in his place once, when his AC cut out by surprise. I actually found out that he was pretty neat. There was no food containers or beer cans lying around, like you might expect a big guy with a beer belly like him to have. Things were all neatly organized and it was a pretty nice space. Our complex was relatively peaceful for the next year, until one night in November. It was raining like it always does in Florida. It was about midnight when someone rang my doorbell. I looked out and saw one of my tenants there, Joseph. Old Joe was one of my retirees who'd retired in Florida to, in his words, play golf and drink beer. Normally he was all smiles and jokes. But that night, his face was completely pale and he looked absolutely frightened. "I hate to bother you, Sam, but something's not right with Andy." I put on my jacket and followed him to the apartment, since Andy was his neighbor. He put his finger to his lip and motioned for me to listen in. I put my ear up to the door, and I could hear Andy fighting with someone. It sounded like whoever he was fighting with was also throwing things around. I was a bit taken aback. He'd never had a guest over since the entire year I'd known him. I knocked and heard him stomp over to the door. He opened it very normally. Normally, he was very well dressed and put together. Like I said, he was not a messy guy at all. This time, though, he answered in a t-shirt with grease stains all over. His hair was limp and greasy, and he reeked of BO. As I looked behind him, I could see the inside was a complete disaster. I asked him if everything was all right. He was irritated and told me it was, then shut the door in my face. I sent Joe back to his place and told him to let me know if he heard anything else, then went to bed. There wasn't much I could really do in this situation. The next morning, I decided to pay Andy a visit to see if he was okay. I went to his place and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I decided I would try again later. I got busy doing other things though, and forgot to do it. So December rolled around. I was starting to gather all the monthly rent checks, but there was none from Andy. That got me a bit worried. He was always on time before, so I knocked on his door. There was still nothing. I knocked again. I heard the guy grunting and moaning now. Maybe I should have called the police first, but instead I opened the door with my emergency key ring. I was hit with the foulest smell I'd ever smelled. It was like shit, vomit, and death were all rolled into one singular nasty thing. The walls were all streaked with what I could only assume was shit, and the place was trashed. I started to call Andy while typing 911 on the phone. I could hear the moaning coming from the back room. What I saw that day, I can never unsee. I sometimes still get flashbacks. Andy was lying naked on the floor of his room on a pile of dirty clothes. He was covered with his own excrement and piss, and there were puddles of vomit everywhere. What was the absolute worst, though, was that he was covered in bites. There were human bites all over his arms and legs, and they were starting to smell of infection. He was also bleeding from his rectum. I wondered who had attacked him. Was it the person we heard him fighting with? I didn't get my answer then. He had to be rushed to the hospital and was fighting for his life in the ICU. The doctor spoke to his sister, who turned out to be his medical guardian, and things slowly started to come into place. Turns out Andy did that all to himself. He suffered from multiple mental disorders. He'd stopped taking his meds the month before November. There was no other person that night. He was arguing with himself. Those bites, he inflicted them on himself. The bleeding from his rectum was from inserting a foreign object in there and doing so much damage he ruptured his own internal organs. He ended up pulling through in the end and went back home to live with his sister. I had the task of cleaning up his apartment. What I found while cleaning freaks me out, the same as finding him lying there that day. He had this old shoebox full of cutouts from magazines, old family photos, even photos he'd taken of residents of the apartments, including myself. All of the eyes were burnt out with cigarettes. On some of them, X's were put over the mouths as well. I'm not sure if that was all part of his mental decline, or if he had always been that way and I just never noticed it. All I can hope for is that Andy got the help he needed and is in a better state now than he was before. I travel pretty regularly, so I don't really struggle with anxiety nor anything about flying. I really quite enjoy it actually. That being said, Flight 72 from New York City to Istanbul in 2012 was easily the scariest experience of my life. We departed from JFK early evening, I want to say about 5 or 6. It was a 10.5-hour flight. A couple of things for background. My plan was to eat the provided dinner, wait a little bit, take the sleeping pills I'd brought, and pass out. Hopefully wake up an hour before landing, and avoid all the monotony that goes with long flights. The other thing to note was that this was not a nice plane. It looked old, it felt old, and it was rickety. It had that old plane smell too. Okay, so everything was going to plan so far. We were about 3 or 4 hours into the flight. I had the dinner, took my pills, and was just starting to fade out when I noticed 2 things. One, the screens throughout the cabin that depicted the flight path and our current location were off. Last I looked, it had shown us a ways off the coast near the middle of the Atlantic. It felt like we were periodically dropping altitude as well. It was odd, because it felt controlled. It wasn't like a big constant drop. Just every few minutes you could sense we were being lowered bit by bit, leveling off intermittently. This sort of piqued my interest enough to shake off the drowsiness that was coming on. I wasn't really nervous at this point though, just curious as to what was going on. I don't think many people on the plane had any idea about anything unusual. That was until we heard over the intercom that we needed to make an unscheduled landing. Flight attendants prepared the cabin. That got people's attention, obviously. My first thought was unscheduled landing where? We're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. I was sitting in the middle of the cabin where the flight attendant station is and the jumper seats they sit on, so it was easy for me to lean over and try to chat with one of them. I asked if they had any more information, if they knew where we were going to land or what was going on. The 2 flight attendants replied they didn't have any more information than we did. So, this sort of quiet anxiety now existed within the cabin. People were chatting quietly between themselves, and everyone was looking around out the windows. It was a clear night. We were over the ocean. All you could see for miles around was water. The screens were down, and we were continuing this sort of periodic descent. 10 minutes passed by, when the captain came on and essentially repeated the same message. Still no more information from the flight attendants. There was this 10-minute pattern of repeating the same message and the word descent, with only the Atlantic Ocean to be seen out the window. I had no idea what to think about all this. Even the flight attendants themselves seemed anxious now. I specifically asked them if it was an emergency landing, if the plane was malfunctioning, but they couldn't confirm or deny anything. Let me just add, though, that the flight attendants were phenomenal for the whole process. They were very patient, very helpful, and I could tell they legitimately didn't have any answers we were looking for. They did a wonderful job of keeping everyone calm and stopping them from panicking. That being said, now the pilot gets on the line and repeats the message, only this time saying we're making an emergency landing. We couldn't have been more than a few thousand feet above the Atlantic at this point. Our descent had continued this whole time. I didn't have the perspective to see forward, obviously, but on both sides of the plane, all I could see was the ocean. There was a palpable anxiety in the cabin, including myself. I always wondered how much that sleeping pill I took coincidentally helped me to calm down in that moment. With how high my adrenaline level was, it certainly wasn't helping me sleep at all. At this point, we were getting closer and closer to the ocean. It looked like we were going to crash land. My heart was thumping in my chest. I got my phone out and started drafting a text to my wife to tell her I loved her, on the small chance it would somehow send. Not sure what I was thinking at that very last moment, though. Nearing the ground, I could see the small light of some fishing boat, then the lights from land. As we touched down on land, everyone clapped and yelled in joy and let out a huge sigh of relief. The pilot got on and said there was a malfunction with the plane. We had made an emergency landing in Newfoundland. It was on a tiny island called Stevensville. I came to find out later there had been an electrical malfunction in the cockpit, and the instrumentation for the pilot was completely inaccurate. He was essentially flying the plane with very limited instrumentation, manual and flying blind. This explains the weird descent pattern he was doing, bit by bit, as he tried to figure out where to land. When it happened over the Atlantic, he had the choice between trying to make it to Iceland or turning back and trying Newfoundland, and chose the latter. I learned that generally they try to plan flight paths across the Atlantic in a sort of arm shape, just in case situations like this do happen, so the pilot has multiple options. In this case, I'm certainly glad he was such a skilled person. I had the chance to talk with him later on in the evening. He wouldn't go into much detail about what happened, but I assumed he would have told me that this was a routine kind of thing. That seasoned pilot probably saved a lot of lives that day, including mine. Beyond all that, though, what happened over the next 8 to 10 hours is another crazy story in itself. But still, that time with those crazy descents were some of the worst and most terrifying times in my life. I'm extremely glad I made it out alive. So I grew up as a middle-class suburban dweeb middle son in a waspy family in a mostly stable home, like many such children. I was left to my own devices quite a bit. When the first modem made its way into the house, along with AOL, I was hooked on chat rooms immediately. That was a pretty momentous occasion for me. Let me explain. I was a very sexually curious child. Therefore, in my teens, I was already desperate for it, despite not knowing what that actually meant. There wasn't really an outlet for all this, though. That mostly meant me spending huge amounts of time alone in my room, thinking abstractly about the topic of sex. When chat rooms became available, that entered the equation. It gave me a wealth of people to talk to about the topic. I basically became addicted. I would lurk in sexually explicit chat rooms for hours on end. After years of being a lurker, casually observing the discourse in these chat rooms, I started participating as well. Being on the internet, it was mostly men, but I was crazed and there was a certain tension. I began to have lewd chats, leading to cyber sex. This was in the days before the proliferation of digital cameras or even scanners, so all of this was strictly text-based. It went on for a little while, generic hookups and chat rooms. I'd roleplay with anyone who came my way. When they inevitably asked for my location, though, I'd give a random suburb anywhere from an hour to 2 hours away from where I actually lived. One day, I remember very clearly, I'd been simmering with one guy in his late teens, only a handful of years older than me. When he asked me where I lived, I lied and returned the question to him. He replied that he lived in the same suburb I actually lived in. I confessed to my lie, saying I'd only lied in the first place to keep creepers away. He commended me for the clever idea, and so it got to be that I'd cyber with this guy every couple of days. He did ask me about phone sex, but I didn't want to get a call on my parents' line. Our sessions turned into discussions of what we would do if we could meet up. He said he had the perfect place, too. We could play in his car together. He asked where a safe spot would be so he could come pick me up. I mentioned a park that was several blocks away. Things continued this way, strictly in the realm of fantasy for a long time. Eventually, though, as in all things, I started to lose interest. I wouldn't sign on for weeks at a time, then months. Whenever I did, he would always be right there, ready to pick off exactly where we'd left off. I was usually willing to oblige. After all, it was just a harmless, idle fantasy. Years later, I'd all but forgotten about that account. We didn't really talk anymore, and I'd never made a newer account either. About 5 years after all this started, I was moving into my college dorms, setting up my new laptop, when I remembered my old AOL handle. I signed back in. It had been years since I last signed on. Surely enough, though, who messaged me first but my old friend? He asked me why I never replied anymore. I told him I was moving and going through some stuff. "Ah, shucks," he replied. "We never did get to meet up." "Yeah," I said. He replied, "It's a real shame that date didn't work out." "What date?" I asked. "We were gonna meet in the Walgreens on your block. Then you chickened out." "Oh, I don't think I remember that." I was racking my brain trying to recall such an event. There was in fact a Walgreens on my block, but it was relatively new. "Yeah, we were in the parking lot, but you drove away before I could even talk to you." I assured him he was mistaken, as I hadn't spoken to him since I got my license. "No, for real, man, you were gonna meet me in that black Ford Focus with the bike rack and the alien sticker on the back?" The room seemed to swim. It felt like I was falling backwards. He'd correctly identified the car I was driving, but I'd never told him about that, nor mentioned those tiny details. I hadn't even sent him a picture that included my face. So how could he have known that was me? I was sure I'd never set anything up either. Was he deliberately messing with me? Trying to let me know he'd found me? Or had the years since this happened twisted my mind? Maybe he'd convinced himself that him stalking me was a meeting we'd mutually arranged. I blocked him and tried to forget about it. I wasn't living in the same town anymore. And even though his stalking prowess was apparently pretty good, I was a significant distance away now, and a pretty athletic guy. If he found me again, I didn't think I'd have much to worry about. I'd nearly forgotten about the whole thing, until the other day. This is nearly a decade later at this point. My older brother and I were catching up, lamenting getting older. I told him there was an old member of my graduating class who had already gone to jail for a felony, served his time, and gotten out. This led to a discussion about friends, classmates, and such who had been arrested. He led with, "Remember Charles? I used to play football with him. Yeah, he was arrested for sexting up kids he met online or something. Crazy." I looked up the case. He'd been tried and convicted for a whole slew of sex crimes. He had apparently been using social sites like MySpace and Friendster to meet young boys. He blackmailed and assaulted some of them when they wanted to break it off. The more and more I read, the more I got a heavy feeling in my stomach. I googled his AIM handle. It wasn't terribly unique. There were similar accounts named on all sorts of sites which were definitely not him. One deeper in the results, though, was an account on a rollerblading forum. Skimming these accounts' posts, I was positive this was the same person I'd been chatting with. Clicking the user profile statistics page, the last login was precisely the day before my brother's friend was arrested. At this point, I had more questions than answers. Was that really him? Was it random chance, or did he choose me through my brother? Is that how he was able to put a face to my name? Was he waiting in my neighborhood on purpose, or was it a coincidence? It felt like years were drained from my life, all in a single moment. I don't like to tell people about my life and the things I have experienced, especially because I have anxiety related to interacting with other people. I've only told this to a few people outside my immediate family, and I've only just recently started talking about it. I really wish I'd told someone sooner though, as I discovered a coworker encountered these people as well. We're talking about it now, and it does seem very therapeutic. Anyway, this is my story. I work downtown, standard 8 to 5 shift. Once in a while, I've worked overtime, but not very often, and not on the day this happened either. It was just a couple of minutes after 5 p.m. I left work, and it was just a few blocks away from my office building to the train station. There were a few bars and back alleys along the way, but the worst I'd ever dealt with were a few homeless folks who got a little too aggressive asking for cash. They didn't bother me much though. The train ride from this station to downtown where I'd parked my car was about 40 minutes if I'm lucky. I managed to grab a seat and didn't have to spend the whole ride standing on that day. It was a pretty lucky happenstance, more or less. I got a seat next to a window, which left the seat next to mine wide open. At the next stop, 3 men got on. One of them sat next to me, and the other sat on the seat across so they were facing me. I was listening to music on my iPod, so I couldn't really hear them. I did notice, however, that the guy sitting next to me was trying to move closer to me on the seat. He would move so close that his leg was touching mine. I'd scoot away, then he would move closer again. Eventually, I was squished up right against the window with no room to move. I had no doubt he had more than a few inches of free space on his side. I was wearing sunglasses and could surreptitiously glance at them. I noticed they would occasionally say something, then all look at me. It was incredibly creepy and uncomfortable. I was nervous about getting off at my stop. Mine was the second to last on the train line. When the train pulled into my station, I got off. The guy sitting next to me tried to grab my arm, but I was moving away too quickly and was able to get out just fine. I was hoping they wouldn't follow me off the train. It was a busy station, so they couldn't have known where I was parked, but they did get off with me. I guess it was just their luck that they targeted me. I'd parked in the furthest spot from the station because the parking in that area was free. It was about a 7-minute walk away. Usually that wouldn't be too bad. This area is very quiet though, and I was worried that these guys were following me. A bit of background. I was quite unfit since I worked an office job and sat down all day, not working out and all that. Add to that my strong sweet tooth and you've got a recipe for a bad body. I was 30 pounds overweight and couldn't run more than 30 seconds at a time. That was pretty depressing for me, considering I ran track and played hockey in high school. I still play some hockey, but on a women's day league, and it's really not that competitive. I'm the youngest on my team anyway, about 20 years old. It's just something I do for fun together with my mom usually. I was crossing the bridge over the road from the station to the parking lot when I noticed the 3 guys were less than 10 feet behind me. I wasn't carrying a knife or any pepper spray because it's illegal in my Canadian city. I do know a little bit about personal protection though, a required class for girls at my private high school that I attended in my youth. I put my house key between my fingers just in case I needed to hit someone with it. At least that would hurt them a little more than my fist. The guys continued to follow me across the main lot. They didn't even try to hide the fact they were there. The more nervous I got, the louder and more excited they became. I managed to get across the road between the lots before they arrived to it. They had to wait for a couple of cars to pass before they could follow me. I was almost halfway across when they crossed the road, and I started to run. I could hear their feet pounding the pavement behind me. I used my clicker to unlock the car when I was close and wrenched the door open. I'm really glad there was no one parked next to me. I barely managed to close my door and slam the lock down when the first guy reached for my car. They all arrived and started banging on my windows, yelling and cheering. I'd never been so afraid in my life. I was worried they'd break the windows and get me all the same. There was a guy in the back hanging off my hatchback too, so I couldn't reverse out of my spot without running him over. Maybe I should have, but I was afraid and not thinking. I was screaming, but no one was around to hear me. I don't know what they wanted, but I knew it couldn't be anything good. I wish I had the screamer my mom had given me for protection, but it needed a new battery, so I hadn't brought it along with me. As I thought about that screamer, though, it made me realize I had something even better. When you're being assaulted, you're not supposed to scream for help. No one wants to help you. You scream fire because everyone wants to watch the blaze. So, I turned on my car alarm. It was incredibly loud, so loud I thought it would go deaf inside my car. It got the immediate reaction I wanted though. The guy started backing off. I could see people walking in the lot looking in the direction of my car. People began to see what was going on. As people began to converge, the guys took off running back toward the train station. I drove home crying. The next night, I started working out. I worked out almost every day since then. If those cars hadn't been on the road at that time, if I'd run just a little slower, if I had been too slow in clicking the locks, it could have all ended very differently. I've lost 20 pounds since then, and have gained a great amount of muscle. I quit my job after. I've had anxiety issues for years, and this encounter made it so much worse. I never want to feel that powerless ever again. I drive a truck on a delivery route in a pretty rural part of Kentucky, so I see a lot of weird things out there. In fact, just today, I witnessed 2 black labs fighting in the middle of the road over something. As I got a little bit closer, I could tell they were fighting tooth and nail over a severed foot. Probably the creepiest thing I ever witnessed, though, was when I drove by a house that was in the midst of being set ablaze by the owner's meth-addled brother. It was relatively late at night, around 10 p.m. or so. All I see is a spark, then flames bursting in my side mirrors. I heard the next day that the brother whose house was being set on fire came out and beat the guy half to death before putting the fire out himself. Lots of crazy stuff happens around here. I've told this story to my friends several times, but I guess I can share it here too. I was driving for Costco a few years back. It was around this time of year actually. We usually took extra toy shipments to various locations due to the holiday season. We got a call that one of our locations in rural Kentucky needed a restock. They knew I was a fast driver, so I was given the last-minute late-night duty. I loaded up my truck and headed out. It was around 3 a.m. or so when I started to have this strange feeling. I chalked it up to just being tired and tried to amp myself up. About 15 minutes later, though, the road started to fog up. I mean, more so than I'd ever seen before. It got to the point where I had to pull off to the side of the road and just wait there. There weren't any other cars on the road, and I was a bit ahead of time, so I figured I could wait until things cleared up a bit. About 5 minutes of sitting still in silence, though, my truck suddenly goes dead. No lights, no engine, nothing. I tried to crank it, but it was like the battery had just suddenly died. I tried my CB, but I couldn't get anyone on. I checked my cell phone. No signal. As I'm sitting there contemplating my next move, I hear what sounds like a child crying outside. It slowly morphed into the sounds of a woman crying, or at least that's what I could make out. It sounded like it was very nearby as well. Now, I'm a big man, 6'3", but I refused to exit my cab. I did roll down my window slightly and called out to ask if anybody needed help. At that point, the crying immediately stopped, and then I heard what sounded like a sinister laugh. I felt like the laughter was directed at me. I rolled my window back up. It seemed like the more scared I became, the louder and louder the laughing got. Then, as soon as this all started, it stopped. Just like that, my truck started back up again, and the fog dissipated soon after. I drove out of there like a bat out of hell. I got to the next truck stop and pulled in. I ran to the bathroom and poured water on my face. I asked myself, did that really just happen? I went out to the diner and see this fella in a John Deere hat, red flannel, blue jeans. I needed to know if anyone else had experienced that too. I go right up to him and say, "Excuse me, I just had one hell of an experience. I'd like to know if you have any news from around this area." He said he'd never heard about it before, so I don't know what was going on that night. So, there was this story a while back by a trucker who shared his creepy experience while out on the road. It was getting very late and very dark, of course, so he pulled into a rest area just off the highway, right in the middle of nowhere. The place was totally empty, meaning there weren't any other vehicles or people there. While he was getting some shut-eye inside his truck, he began to hear the faint sound of a barking dog that seemed to get louder and louder as time went by. Eventually, this nasty barking sound was coming from right outside his driver's side door. As he got up to look out the window, he didn't see a rabid dog there, but instead a crazy-eyed person looking directly at him, growling like a dog and trying to get in. He started the engine and got the hell out of there, asking no questions about it. So this is a bit of a weird one. I was driving from Albuquerque to Socorro. I was on a stretch with no lights. It was perfectly dark when I noticed someone in the headlights standing on the side of the road. As I was passing by him, my lights fully illuminated this guy's face. Nothing about this man seemed natural. His posture was weird. He was wearing a gray suit, and his face, it just looked off. As I observed, I noticed he was wearing a mask or something. For half a second we locked eyes, even with my headlights clearly blinding him. It still felt like he was looking at me somehow, not my truck. It really creeped me the fuck out. Shortly after this, my CB started picking up some odd chirps as well. I rushed to my destination fast as possible. I guess I was pretty close to the VLA though. The high desert can be a pretty damn weird place. A year ago, I was 28 years old, living in a condo in southern Arizona. I'm a single parent and live with my 3 children and my dog, a Belgian shepherd named Loki. The neighborhood we lived in was very quiet and friendly. My children would often play outside with the neighbors' kids on a daily basis. I didn't have to watch them like a hawk. Plus, my neighbor worked in his garage all day and was able to keep an extra set of eyes on the kids as well. One fall night last year, I was doing my usual chores, vacuuming, cleaning the rooms, and washing the clothes. I wanted to do as much as I could before the kids came back from their grandparents' house the next morning. I had a sliding glass door in my bedroom that I usually left halfway open, so it would be easier for me to go back and forth to the garage where the washing machine was located. Loki also loved to have it open because it was the easiest access for him to run back and forth from inside and outside. I went out through my sliding glass door and opened up the garage. While I was putting the lid back down, I turned around and saw Loki growling, his eyes fixated up on the roof. I looked up to see what he could be growling at, but I didn't see anything there. Figuring it was only a stray cat, I started to walk back into the house and was about to slide the door shut behind me. That was when I noticed Loki hadn't moved and was still out in the alley. Normally, I didn't even have to call him in. He usually just followed behind me. I called for him multiple times, but he didn't so much as look in my direction. He was just sitting still, looking up at the roof as though he were waiting for something to appear there. Suddenly, he jumped up and started snarling, barking viciously at the roof once more. At the same time, I heard the heavy thuds of footsteps moving across my roof just over my head. That was frightening enough already, but what scared me the most was the way Loki was reacting. I had only ever seen him act like that once before, and that was when I was almost robbed back when I was in Washington years earlier. I quickly rushed out and pulled Loki inside, then shut the door behind me and locked it. I was very shaken, pacing back and forth. Loki was crying and growling. I texted one of my neighbors and asked if he could swing by my house and check things out. I didn't feel confident enough that something was really going on to call the police yet. When my neighbor arrived, he physically climbed up onto the roof and didn't find anything. We both concluded it was probably some sort of animal, but I couldn't shake the gut feeling that those thumps across the roof sounded far too heavy to be made by a cat or a squirrel or something. A few days go by and I didn't hear anything more, so I'd almost forgotten all about it. The next morning comes, and before it was fully light out, I was awake and brushing my daughter's hair, getting her ready for school. That's when I heard loud footsteps echoing across my roof once more. I grabbed my old military machete from under my bed and ran out back with Loki. There was nothing. I circled back around to the front, but I still couldn't find anything there. I went inside to reassure my daughter it was probably just a cat, but she looked at me with terrified, wide eyes. She said it sounded like someone was running away. Later that day, when I came home from work, I saw police cars down the street at my neighbor Colleen's house, with an ambulance as well. Colleen was a very sweet, older, and fragile lady. I eventually found out that someone had broken into her home while she was napping. Colleen apparently startled the assailant. He had shoved her into the wall and broken her hip. Colleen lay upon the ground in pain, unable to move until her daughter came to check on her. The police officer started to question the rest of us if we had seen or heard anything suspicious lately. I immediately told those officers about the footsteps on my roof and how my dog had reacted and responded to them. The police had officers patrol our neighborhood for about a week. I told my daughters what was going on and explained to them that they couldn't play outside freely at the moment, at least not as they were used to. 2 weeks passed by, and I was still on guard. It was late one night, and I needed to do some laundry. I decided I wasn't going to let my nerves prevent me from getting my parental chores done. I had the glass door open and was on the very last load. I was walking towards the garage when I paused dead in my tracks and couldn't move, barely breathing. I tried not to make a sound. I heard creaking up on the roof. I slowly looked up and finally realized where it was coming from. Directly above me. My heart sank and my blood went cold. I know that feeling of being watched wasn't just my imagination. Loki was by my side. He snarled and barked viciously while trying to jump up on his hind legs. I dropped my basket of laundry and ran back inside. Just as I made to close the door, I screamed for Loki to come in. He came sprinting inside, and I immediately locked the door. Just barely a moment after, I saw a shadowy figure jump down from my roof. My oldest daughter came in, and I told her to get my phone and take her siblings into her bedroom and call 911. Loki was practically foaming at the mouth, desperately wanting to go out and get this fucker. I was absolutely terrified, shaking uncontrollably. The figure was just standing there in my backyard, not moving at all. I was unable to take my eyes off them. I had been to war and seen terrible things, but when my children were now suddenly in the crossfire, this felt much different. The strange man literally walked directly up to me, right outside the glass window. He just stared in, glaring at me with anger in his eyes, as if I had just rear-ended his car or something. He was wearing a hooded sweatshirt and held a crowbar in his hands. I remembered the machete that was right by my nightstand. I didn't want the man to know that I had it available, though. If he tried to break in, I wanted to be able to give him the element of surprise. He jiggled the handle to try and open the door, then smacked against it with the crowbar. The window didn't shatter or anything, though. My kids were yelling hysterically as he started hitting the door harder and harder. I realized this guy had every intention of coming in, so I swiftly grabbed my machete and yelled, "Come on, fucker!" The shock in his eyes was a glorious sight. One of the patrolling officers was nearby. He hopped my fence and started shouting at the guy to drop his crowbar. When he didn't do it, the cop tased him. As the officer put him in cuffs, I went to go get my kids. When they saw me, they came running and started hugging me tight. The would-be home invader was charged and sent to prison soon after. My kids are still going to therapy. I'm doing whatever I can to help them cope with everything. Loki is still with us, and we love him very much. If I ever see that guy again, though, I'm not going to hold back. Everyone keeps telling me how lucky I was, and I truly agree, but I always remind them that that guy was even more lucky he didn't break in through that glass, because he would have had to deal with me. This is a story my uncle told me before he passed away. Unfortunately, I'm unable to provide much proof of this occurrence, but I don't think he would lie about something like this. I'm going to write this story from his perspective, as it was told to me. It was the mid-1980s in Arkansas. My girlfriend at the time dragged me to this wedding. She was close friends with the bride, and the wedding was taking place on a ranch. I have to say, it was a pretty nice setup, surrounded on all sides by thick forests that stretched on for miles. We were literally in the middle of nowhere. It took us 3 hours just to reach the damn place from where we lived, but the journey was so worth it. Even though I didn't know a lot of people there, I had a really great time. I even found myself dancing, and I never danced, so that's how you know it was real good. There was an open bar, so as you can imagine, things got pretty wild as the night progressed onward. After about an hour of reenacting Saturday Night Fever on the dance floor, I sat down. My feet were really starting to hurt. Before I go on, let me explain the layout of this ranch. The outdoor dance floor was located in a clearing and was surrounded on all sides by trees. There was a tree line about 35 to 40 yards away from where I was, and there was a lot of bright lights around the dance floor. Beyond that area, though, it was pitch black. As I was sitting there rubbing my sore feet, I could see something taking place in the distance, just outside of the tree line. I couldn't see it too clearly because of the lighting over there, but what I saw sort of amused me. I saw what looked like a dark figure dragging someone into the tree line. Again, it was somewhat hard to see, but I thought the person that was being dragged was wearing one of those bright yellow bridesmaid dresses. I chuckled when I saw that. I remember thinking, looks like someone drank too much, huh? I feel the need to point out right now that I was also obviously intoxicated. Otherwise, I would have said something about someone being dragged away from the party into the dark forest. Honestly, I thought maybe the two were going to get freaky in the woods or something. A few hours later, we left the wedding celebrations, but what I found out 2 days later made my stomach drop. Apparently, one of the bridesmaids had gone missing after the wedding. I told police what I remembered seeing that night the very next day. They found the body of the missing bridesmaid in the woods. She had been dismembered. Her limbs were found scattered throughout the forest. From what I hear, they didn't even recover all of her body parts. The person responsible for this was never found either. I felt guilty for many years after, because I can't help but think I could have saved her life if I had said something to anyone. She wasn't even 20 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her, but she ended up in pieces in the forest because of some random asshole. Here's some backstory for you. I lived in rural Kentucky my whole life. I'm 52 and currently semi-retired. I used to be a contractor, but I suffered a nasty accident that rendered my left hip near useless. I'm on disability now, but I do odd jobs in the local town. Sometimes I hunt or help train younger contractors in what to do, give them advice, and try to keep myself busy. I have 2 kids with my ex-wife, who are now in their late 20s, and one with my current wife who's turning 8 next month. My wife is Spanish, so my son looks fully Spanish as well, even though he's half Caucasian. Everyone in town knows my name and my family. They also know I'm a good, humble family man. I personally helped build the house we're living in. It's deep in the woods, and the nearest neighbor is about 3 miles away. Last weekend, my 8-year-old son woke me and my wife at around 2 in the morning. Little Jake is a sensitive kid, so the slightest bump in the night causes him to panic. We were used to this and we didn't mind, but when he said there was a fire outside in the woods, I was immediately struck in alarm. Still only half awake, I bolted to look outside my bedroom window and noticed that in the distance, the night sky was glowing orange. There was smoke rising only 500 yards away from our house. My wife started to panic, picking up the phone and calling the local fire department. I took the phone from her shaking hands and set it down for a moment. I knew this couldn't be from a wildfire. The light and smoke were coming from one singular area. A wildfire would be widespread out by now, since the woods we live in are very dense, and fire travels fast. This must have been a controlled fire, which in a way might be far worse. The local fire department wouldn't be able to help with that. I threw on my hunting gear and rushed my wife and son to the basement. I handed her my cell phone and told her to call her brother. I shut the door and told her to lock it and not open it for anyone other than her brother or myself. I retrieved my bolt-action rifle. My intention was not to harm anyone, but rather find out who was setting this controlled fire in the forest. Maybe I could scare them off or get them to put out the fire peacefully. Ultimately, though, I knew that was a decision they were going to be making for me. I deadbolted the front door and left the house. My wife's brother had a key, but wouldn't arrive for at least 20 minutes. I ventured off into the almost complete darkness of my property, following the smell of smoke and the tinge of orange light in the sky. As I approached closer, I could hear the sounds of an ever-increasing sermon being spewed. I got to the tree line that overlooked a clearing, and it was exactly what I expected. Klansmen, about 7 of them in a circle, with their arms stretched out while a smooth-talking preacher was spewing hate, using Christ as a justification. The preacher was standing in front of a makeshift cross as it continued to burn. I've had run-ins with these Klansmen before due to my property's relative seclusion. They tend to hold sermons out in the woods where no one can find them, especially in the woods surrounding my house for whatever reason. It only happens maybe twice a year, if not less. Usually I fire off a round into the sky and tell them to fuck off back wherever they came from. Then they scatter off like little cockroaches. I watched as the preacher paused for his followers to say amen and white power and all that shit. That's when I shot off a round into the sky. All of them jumped about 4 feet off the ground. As I moved towards the fire, I called out to them, "You must be new here. This is my property, and I don't appreciate these activities going on near my family." I loaded another bullet into the chamber and positioned my rifle near my right hip, not taking aim at them and showing overt hostility yet. While the other followers slowly stepped back, their preacher stepped forward, coming within 30 yards of me. "This is your property?" he said with a thick Kentucky accent. "I apologize. We scouted the area during the day and didn't see a single house around here. You mind telling us where you live, just so we can meet a bit further away from you and your family?" I didn't answer this preacher's silver tongue. It may have been able to work on his flock of sheep here, but it wasn't going to work on me. There was a tense silence between us before one of his sheep spoke up. "I know this guy. He's married to he even has a half-breed with her." The other sheep began grumbling amongst themselves and moved closer toward me. I raised my rifle up below my shoulder and pointed it at them to force them to back away. The preacher chuckled to himself before speaking. "So that's why you don't want to tell us where you live, huh? You think we're gonna break in and harm your family? Good sir, we may hate your wife and child, but we ain't no savages." "You may not be, but that ain't for me to decide, and I don't trust your friends here," I said bluntly. I kept my rifle aimed and ready just in case. "You can't choose who you love after all," the preacher said. I bet he was sporting a shit-eating grin under his hood while saying that. "You have my word we'll never lay a hand on you or your family, so maybe we can arrange a deal." My stomach dropped. My trigger hand trembled slightly. A vague threat was still a threat. "You don't bring this up with law enforcement or anyone else, and we'll relocate our get-togethers further away from your family. How I see it, you don't have much a choice. You already fired 1 shot. You think you could take all 8 of us with a bolt action? My friend, that is simply impossible." I remained silent and took a moment to breathe, so I could make my voice remain strong and firm. My palms were sweaty. Another 700 yards further into the woods, there's another clearing. If you hold your meetings there from now on, I won't acknowledge what you do, but if you ever come near me again, I'll bring more than a bolt action next time. You have yourself a deal." He offered up his hand to shake, but I stared him down right past the slits of his hood, my rifle still raised. I didn't accept his filthy hand. "Very well, we'll be on our way to check out this promising area. You can head on home now. Just be sure to tuck Jake in tight." This must be a dreadful experience for the poor boy. I stood dead still in total shock. My vision began to blur as the preacher and his flock of sheep moved toward the location I pointed them to. Part of me wasn't surprised. I worked in the community my entire life. The other part of me was in panic mode though. If he knew my son, he knew where I lived already. I often held local events at my home. This gathering was not a coincidence. It was a warning, a threat. I got a hold of myself and moved slowly back into the tree line, watching as their white robes faded into the darkness of the night. I hobbled as quickly as I could back to my home, looking over my shoulder whenever I heard a twig snap or the wind rustling the trees. When I finally made it back, I breathed a sigh of relief and let my wife's brother know what happened. I didn't tell my wife though. If she knew, she would have never gotten a good night's sleep in that house ever again. My wife's brother slept in the guest bedroom in the basement, and we took turns keeping guard during the night. There wasn't a single sign of their return, but I'm still on high alert even during the day, and especially when I go into town. So far, they've apparently kept their word. Right now, as I write this, I see the sky turning orange and the smoke starting to rise in the distance. It's far enough away to indicate their use of that clearing I recommended. I just wish I could get rid of them entirely. At the time of this incident, I was 18, and very much not intimidating. 5'2", slightly stocky, maybe 130 pounds at the most. I was staying at a friend's house, which was off a back road way out in the country of Mississippi. Her street was full of other family members. Once you got to the main road, it was an unlit, treacherous, curvy area that went right through the woods and was covered on both sides by ditches. It would be suicide to choose to drive drunk, especially at night. With that context, I'll tell you one of the creepiest moments of my entire life. I left her house around 1:30 in the morning, slightly buzzed but still coordinated enough to drive. I turned my music up, lit up my high beams, and made the turn onto the main road. It was less than 2 minutes away from my friend's house when out of nowhere, a lady suddenly appeared in my headlights. I slammed on the brakes and pulled across the road into the oncoming lane. I stopped on alert for a possible trap. I rolled down the passenger side window and asked this woman if she was all right. She was probably in her late 20s, very disheveled and moving like she was walking across thin ice or something. After a moment, she replied in a raspy and unhinged voice, "I'm very angry with my husband. I stepped out in front of your car to kill myself." No hesitation, just admitted that to me like she was offering me morning coffee. "Are you fucking serious?" I shouted at her. She asked me for a light, even though she didn't seem to have any cigarettes. She shambled up to my car. I rolled up my window as soon as she made to reach inside. I could already smell the liquor on her. She very nearly got her fingers trapped in my window. As soon as I started to roll forward, she started screaming at me, rambling on about how she hated her husband and wanted to die right now. I carefully drifted forward, watching her following me in my rearview mirror. As I pulled out my phone from my purse and attempted to dial 911, she jumped on my trunk and started banging with both hands. I took my foot off the brake and gave it a little more gas to put some distance between me and her. She jumped off. As the operator came on the line, by the light of my headlights, I noticed up the road that a red truck had crashed into a ditch. It had to have been fairly recently, as the hood of the truck was still smoking. The operator raised her voice, and I realized she was repeating herself whatever she was saying. I apologized to the woman and told her the name of the road I was on and the situation with the truck, and this drunk suicidal woman who was still following me. Suddenly, from the driver's side window, there was a loud thump. The light of my cell phone shining in my face, I turned left to see a grizzled man sticking his face into my window. He was shining his phone's flashlight directly in my eyes, screaming for me to stop and open the fucking door. His face was covered in blood. I screamed so loudly that every 911 operator in the building probably heard me. I dropped my phone and floored it, leaving both the man and the woman behind. There was a bloody handprint staining my driver's side window. After a minute of driving close to 80 miles an hour, I finally slowed down and told the operator the further details of what just happened. I hung up when she asked my name though, mostly because I was freaked out. I drove straight home and never called back. To this day, I don't know what their situation was or what became of them. All I know is I'm never driving down an isolated road at night, especially in Mississippi. Never again. I grew up in southern Mississippi, and like most Mississippi kids, my parents were super young when they had me. My mom was a major alcoholic for most of her life, and it was pretty bad back then. My dad worked all the time, which meant my younger sister and I got to spend all our time at home with her. Sometimes when she needed a break from us, or when she just wanted to go on another bender, she'd leave us with my great aunt, who was 98 years old at the time and very senile. Her property also bordered a mental hospital. My grandmother used to tell us stories about being at my great aunt's house when random people would wander up asking to use her phone. Sometimes they would even still be wearing hospital gowns. I was 8 years old when this specific incident happened. My mom dropped us off sometime in the afternoon on Friday. My sister, who was 5, went straight to the living room to play with toy horses next to my great aunt, who was wrapped up and knitting a blanket on a recliner while watching TV. A timer in the kitchen went off, and she asked me to take some biscuits out of the oven for her. As I walked past the window that overlooked a large willow tree in the front yard, I thought I could see the figure of a man underneath the branches. I couldn't tell if it was just a trick of the shadows or something though, so I called for my great aunt to come over and check it out. When she got to the window, she pushed her glasses up to the bridge of her nose. I pointed to the tree and said, "I think I see someone out there." She squinted her eyes and studied the tree for a moment before throwing her hands up and laughing. I was so confused. She looked down at her old leather watch and whispered to herself, "Oh, silly me, it's that time again." She began to shuffle out of the room, saying, "The bicycle man is hungry." I followed her into the back room. She then turned on a lamp that was next to an old, torn black leather couch, where a pillow and blanket were laid out. There were 2 half-empty glasses of water on the table. She picked the pillow up and fluffed it a bit, then began straightening the blanket. As she did this, she began to tell me how the bicycle man visited her every night. They'd have some dinner, then coffee, then she'd put him to bed. He'd ride off in the morning on his bicycle. At this point, 8-year-old me was completely creeped out, and I began to feel my body tremble. I moved quietly back into the living room, crawling on my hands and knees, not wanting to be seen from outside. I locked myself in a spare bedroom with my sister. I pulled the house phone in with me. I desperately tried calling my mom, but unsurprisingly, she didn't pick up. I didn't know my dad's work number, and this was before he had a cell phone anyway. We heard whoever this man was enter the house. He had a very deep voice and was coughing quite a lot. I don't remember what he and my great aunt were talking about, but he used a lot of profanities and barked with laughter. She asked him some question, and I distinctly remember him talking about some sort of blood stains or something. He said it slowly though, almost like he was singing. My sister and I didn't come out for supper. We stayed there until it got dark out. I made my sister share the bed with me. As I lay awake, still as I could, so low in my breathing that I could hear whatever noise this man might be making at any corner of the house. But I remember my heart skipping a beat when I heard heavy footsteps walking down the hall. They made their way just outside our door. Then the doorknob started turning. I knew my aunt had a key to this room, and I remember praying that the strange man didn't know where to find it. After a moment of wrestling with the locked door, the man let out a mournful, almost disappointed cry, like the sound a kid might make after he dropped his ice cream cone. The footsteps walked back down the hall. I stared at the door in terror, my heart pounding in my ears. I don't even remember falling asleep that night. I just remember the sound of something moving around in the kitchen. The next morning, as soon as I realized what time it was, I hauled ass into the kitchen and explained what happened to my mom the night before. She looked really concerned, so she asked my great aunt about it. She gave her the same story that she had given me the night before about the bicycle man. I told my mom about the makeshift bed in the back room, too. We went to take a look at the couch. Another half-empty glass of water was on the nightstand, and the bedspread was messy, as if someone had slept there and left in a real hurry. My mother flipped her shit, then called her friend at the sheriff's office about this stranger on a bicycle. A few days later, my mom got a call from her friend that they had picked up a guy on a bicycle who was trying to break into a house nearby. They found a knife, some rope, and several bags of biscuits on him. Apparently, he had been responsible for several break-ins in the area while he had been staying with my aunt the entire time. I tried to find some newspaper articles or anything online about this bicycle man, but needless to say, with those search terms, they didn't bring much luck. My great aunt passed away a couple of years later. As for the bicycle man, I don't remember what his name was or what became of him. I barely remember what he even looked like, but he gave me the worst night of my entire life. This didn't happen to me, but rather a friend of mine when he was driving a truck from the US to Canada. He usually carries a gun of some kind, but he couldn't take one with him into Canada. Late one night, he woke up to a man in his truck. The man looked right at him and stared at my friend without saying a word. The guy showed my friend he had a machete and went back to rummaging through my friend's things. Now, even though my friend could not carry a gun into Canada, he was allowed a flare gun. My friend pulled out the flare gun and pointed it at the man currently robbing him. There was an intense standoff for a few moments, gun against machete. The man slowly began to get out of the truck, then took off running into the night. My friend didn't let him get away that easy, though. He shot him in the back with the flare gun and swiftly drove away after. No idea what happened to the guy he shot.